So, 7 o'clock. Okay. So, 7 o'clock, Tuesday, January 18th. I want to say hello and welcome everybody to the Rock and Roll Book Club, the inaugural meeting of the online Rock and Roll Book Club, which might just be me sitting here, standing here, yammering into the camera for half an hour about things I only marginally know about. If that's the case, so be it. But if you are here, and you are watching through Facebook Live, please feel free to say hello in the chat, identify yourself. You're probably one of my friends, but it's okay. I still want to hear from you anyway. For those of you who I have not had the pleasure to meet, my name is Don Sev. Sev is not my full name. That is just the one syllable in my last name that everyone can pronounce. I'm a singer, songwriter, guitarist, linguist, writer based in the Ottawa area. I am one of those people who took up music during the whole thing with the lockdowns and COVID. I hate to give you a bit of background on myself. I wanted to be a rock and roller as a kid, but I had the misfortune of growing up in a very small farming community in eastern Ontario in the 1980s when there were still not a lot of options left for women, let alone women who wanted to play guitar and play in rock bands. So I kind of parked that dream for a number of years and didn't really do anything with it until personal circumstances right before my 50th birthday a couple of years ago just made me realize now's the time to do it. And I realized with the lockdowns with during the pandemic that this was probably the closest I was ever going to get to having that Virginia Woolf ideal of having 500 pounds in a room of one's own. So, in my tiny little one bedroom apartment here on the west end of Ottawa, I have been writing songs, recording songs, making music, trying really hard to learn how to be a good guitarist, which is really, really hard when you have to do everything by yourself. So, my idea with this rock and roll book club was to get together a like minded community of people who love books, who love rock and roll, and who would love to read books about rock and roll, and not the staples, not the staple books, like not the ones everyone reads, like Hammer of the Gods. More like Gods of the Hammer, where it's like, do you want to read a book about Teenage Head and talk about it? Great, we'll read a book about Teenage Head and we'll talk about it. That's actually going to be the first weekend of May, because we're celebrating I think it's Gordy Lewis's 65th birthday this year. So we're going to be celebrating it, doing Gods of the Hammer. So that's coming up first week in May. So this is basically my idea, is that I've never been a fan of the idea of dumb rock and roll. I've never been a huge fan of the idea that just because music is popular, it has to be stupid or it has to talk down to people. I love the idea of music as connection, which has proved to be even more difficult, but even more rewarding during this whole time, during the pandemic and the lockdowns and stuff like that. So that was basically my main motivator for starting this rock and roll book club. I wanted to have something where people could get together and talk about intelligent topics and talk about great things about rock and roll without feeling stupid or like they had to talk about the same things that people always talk about. And get something out of it. If it's, just the opportunity to meet other like-minded people, that's great. If it's the opportunity to branch out and read a bunch of books about music that you haven't had a chance to read about before, that's great too. Whatever you want to get out of it, that's the most important thing. So, again, I don't know if anybody's going to be joining us. If you are joining us from wherever, please say hello in the chat. Like I said, I do have my iPad down here. I'm trying really hard not to look at myself because I don't like the way I look on camera. But if you are here, pop your hi into the chat so I can at least give you a shout out. Just a note that I am recording this and I will be putting it up on my YouTube channel for a couple of months. And then when I get started on something like a Patreon, then I'll probably download the content from there and put it up there and have like a chronicle of all the rock and roll book clubs that we'll be doing over the next couple of months. Just looking ahead for the next few weeks, right behind me, you see the books that we'll be doing for the next couple of weeks. Rock and Roll Book Club is always at 7 p.m. Tuesdays, the first and third Tuesday of every month. So February 1st, we're going to be doing Major Labels by Kelly Fasana, who's a writer for the New Yorker magazine. February 15th will be Liz Phair's Horror Stories, which is a fabulous read. It is Not an easy read. It's definitely not light reading, but it's extremely rewarding. And to get into Women's Month, International Women's Month in March, the first book we're going to do on March 1st is going to be Nobody Asked Me About the Girls by Lisa Robinson. And Lisa Robinson was a famous writer who chronicled a lot of the New York scene in the early 80s, like the Ramones, and who has always interviewed women artists like Beyonce, Lady Gaga, Pat Benatar, but found that they just weren't, people just weren't as interested in the women artists, even though the women artists many times had much more interesting, richer lives. So that's a book we're going to look at for March 1st, and I believe March 18th is going to be Sylvia Patterson's I'm Not With the Band, which is not a book that we see a lot in Canada, but still going to be an interesting viewpoint into rock and roll anyway. So let's get started. I see there's still nobody in the chat, so oh well, it happens. So today's book, or the book that I had suggested for today, was Sellout by Dan Ozzy. And as I mentioned in the introductory videos, the promotional videos last week, it says on the top of it that it's a book about punk, emo, and hardcore. It is, and it isn't. It's a book that's mostly about decision making, and it basically looks at the lifespans of the breakout albums of 11 of now. To say that because I wasn't in Canada during this time period, I don't recognize a lot of these bands. I know some of them by name. I know most of them, obviously I read the book, so I know all of them by reputation now, by their stories. But when I was living in Spain, we didn't hear about At the Drive-In or Rise Against, for example. Like, those bands just weren't popular in Spain, or they would have been popular in Spain, but with a very specific group of people. They wouldn't necessarily have been bands that were huge internationally in that sense. Not the same way that Green Day was, for example. So, where was I going with this? Right. So, decision making. Like, what bands need to think about if they're going to, decide to sign to a major label. Like, for a lot of them, it was like, it's a question like, do we get, how much artistic liberty do we get? How much money do we get? Is it going to give us enough money that we're able to continue on? But then also looking at it from the fans' point of view too, where the fans would be like, you're selling out, you're doing this. And to me, the concept of selling out has always been a really fascinating one, because it's not one that you hear about in other kinds of art. For example, I've got a background in theater. I don't ever remember, maybe, people who worked in other theater scenes, but I worked in London and Toronto, and I don't remember anybody ever getting, balled out for, playwrights getting balled out for selling out. If they were offered the chance to do a show for the BBC or the CBC, they were like, everyone was like, oh my God, that's such a great idea. That's such a great opportunity. Good for you. Bias drinks, you bastard, kind of thing. So I've always been, drawn to that idea about selling out as a concept. Like, what does that actually mean to sell out? And why are people so personally invested in the idea of people selling out or people not selling out? Like, if you presumably love a band, wouldn't you want that band to have enough economic security that they could continue doing the kind of music and creating the kind of art that, you love them for, And now, I obviously saying that, I realize that, art is a trajectory. It's not like everybody has to do the same thing all the way through all the time. But I always found it really fascinating how it was just like music, people in music had this idea of selling out. And especially it was like the more fringe elements of it. That sounds bad. Let me rephrase that. The less commercial types of music, like punk, emo, and hardcore, they seem to have, and I can remember this even living in Toronto in the 1990s, there was an idea of purity that I think came into a sense of group identity almost, like, this is who we are. And if you study anthropology or sociology, in any kind of detail, one of the first things that you learn is group identity is forged by a bunch of different things. It's forged about, in the sense of who you are versus who you are not. It's forged by the language that you use, which, on a side note for linguistics, because I am a linguist as well, if you're interested in that, this is a really good book. And we'll be bringing in some ideas from this book as well. Hi, Elizabeth. I know you're reading this one. How we dress, how we eat, where we go, where we don't go, that whole idea of like, how do we define who we are? Because in a very broad sense, culture is who are we? And, this is how we do it, depending on how you define we. So that was one of the reasons why I always thought selling out was an interesting phenomenon, because it was like, how do you define this we? At what point, can you sell out and still be part of the we, for example? Or is selling out kind of a way of saying, well, no, I just, we've decided that you no longer belong to the group, that you no longer share the values of the group, and we're kicking you out. So in preparing for questions for this book club, which I was kind of hoping to ask if anybody's in there. If you're in there again, please say something in the chat, because I'm going to wrap this up in 15 minutes if nobody's here. That was one of the things that I've always been interested in, was the idea of selling. And so I started thinking about bands who I like, and I've got a pretty diverse, taste in music, in terms of geography and genres. Bands that I liked who I thought had sold out, and the only one I could really think of, and Scott D, I know you're thinking of this one too, because you and I always talked about this one, was how U2, kind of, altered course after the Unforgettable Fire, and became this like huge, like, hair shirt wearing band, and they were just like totally like, riffing on angst and stuff like that. And it was like, Scott, I remember you and I having this conversation once about like, oh, there's but I don't think we actually said that they were selling out. I think they just like, it was almost as if like somebody had just knocked them off course. Like, somebody's sailing and the wind picks up from another direction, and all of a sudden you thought you were going this way, but now you're going this way. You're like 50 degrees off the starboard, and away you go. I don't know about, here's the thing I cannot talk about. I can't really talk about the idea of selling out. What I can talk about is the idea of decision making, which is a lot of what this book is about. It's a book about how do you make that decision, what leads you to do it. And for me, it was interesting seeing how bands were really conscientious about planning their careers in the long term, or if the opportunity to go with a major record label was just an opportunity that came up, and they just decided to run with it, or they just said, screw it, we're not going to do it. Or they waited, And I think that the bands, from reading the book, it sounded like a lot of the bands, and maybe this is a rock and roll thing, but it sounded like a lot of the bands didn't really have a long-term plan for their careers. Now, I could be totally wrong. If you were a fan of Blink-182 or My Chemical Romance, like, feel free to correct me on this one. Feel free to correct me in the chat so I know you're here. The sense that it was just kind of like, look, this is a really good deal and it's being offered now. We have to take advantage of this now. We have to leap on this opportunity now, and not think ahead towards, oh, well, are they going to stick with us in the long term? Are they, what happens if the A&R person who helped us get this record deal leaves for another, record company, or at that point in time, especially at the, the turn of 2000s, 2010, leaves for a streaming platform? What do we do then? I mean, how do we, what happens if the entire record deal goes pear-shaped and we've decided that we can't deal with the record company that we're with? How are we going to get out of this, and what are we going to do with the material? That was an extremely fascinating thing to look at, and especially, from the record company's point of view, because one thing that Dan Ozzy does really, really well, but without being like super overbearing about it, is that there's this, throughout the 11 chapters of the book, through which he maps the careers and the decision-making of these groups, one thing that's really interesting is that he inadvertently, or probably by design, but not overtly, charts the decline of the record companies as well, and shows how people go from, or how the industry went from, you sign an album, you sign a deal, and then you make an album, and then you tour, and then that's like a 36-month life cycle. in making and promoting this product, after which you have to go through and do it again. So we start in 1994 with Green Day in the Bay Area, in and around San Francisco. There's no Napster. There's no such thing as a streaming platform. Everything is on CDs, maybe a few cassettes, vinyl maybe, but like believe me, in the 1990s, people couldn't get rid of their vinyl fast enough. For those of you who are like super into collecting records, you would have killed to have a time machine to go back and in the 1990s, go into your local Salvation Army or bargain bin whatever, and just sweep up all the stuff that is now going for like $200 on Discogs. I haven't paid that much for albums, but I've definitely cashed in. And because everyone back then in the 1990s, they just were like, compact discs were easy. They were shippable. They were far easier to ship. They were far less fragile than LPs were. So it made a lot more sense to invest in this. They were easy to burn too. So we start off with Green Day. In 1993, 1994, there is no vinyl per se. There are record companies. And all the way through the book, we see how the record companies and how the record industry the major labels go from being, speaking of which, our very first major labels, how this goes from being purely like a physical object, like it's like a CD, to being something where it's just kind of like it's in the ether, As a side note, having I heard Patrick Pentland of Sloan talking about this a couple of months ago, where he was talking about how Sloan, just not that Sloan is punk. I mean, Sloan has his punk elements, but that's not what I'm getting at here. Basically, Sloan had kept all of their publishing rights, all of the rights to their material, because that was their long-term business plan, and that was going to be their retirement plan, that they were going to be able to cash in on their catalog and be able to save up money for retirement this way. And then streaming came along. And streaming was, I think one of the interesting things about streaming was that it made music so much more international. Like, for those of you who are a bit younger, it may be really, really hard for you to believe how difficult it was for some of us to look for world music or for, punk bands or rock bands from international labels. And you either had to plan a trip to the UK or to Amsterdam or wherever to buy records or, include a record buying day in your trips. And then, because it was either that or you just ended up having to spend an absolute metric butt ton of money at Sam's or A&A or specialty record shops trying to find what it was you wanted. So it's interesting because on the one hand, it's made music so much more accessible geographically in a genre sense, but at the same time, it's brought down the earnings of the musicians. And if the musicians are suffering, that the record companies are probably not going to get into it because they just don't have the money, they don't have the resources, because they don't have anything coming in. So they can't put anything out towards the artists, which is a whole other talk we should have at some point in time here on the page. Anyway, so that is one of the other backstories that's very fascinating about this book. It's fascinating to see how the record companies go in decline, and they don't seem to have a clue that this is going to basically kneecap them. That they, for some reason, I don't know what it was, and it's not outlined in the book. If anybody actually knows or can refer me to a source where they talk about this a bit more, how record companies basically completely missed the boat on the streaming thing, I would be very interested in hearing about it, because I think it would be an interesting, it's an interesting business case to find out why people just couldn't, get on top of this, or why they just looked at it and went, oh no, this isn't going to make us money, we're just going to leave it. And then they just ended up getting totally subverted, and just having the rug completely pulled out from under them. So that's the other interesting part of the book, is that you see this decision-making machine, which in the beginning has a ton of money. It has a ton of A&R people who are going out, and they're looking for the next Green Day. They're looking for the next Offspring. They're looking for the next Nirvana. And gradually, the whole infrastructure starts crumbling beneath their feet. And because they're standing at on the highest point of the building, they don't see the degradation being the thing that's going to lead to their downfall. So that was really cool. The other thing I really liked about this book was it doesn't it doesn't take sides. It doesn't say like one side is inherently better than the other, that the musicians are inherently better business people than the people working as A&R reps or the people heading up the record companies. It doesn't take sides like that. It just looks at it from a very, very humanistic point of view, keeping in mind that musicians are also people. Musicians have lives. Musicians have conflicts. Musicians always question, musicians question their identity. Perfect example being Against Me's Laura Jane Grace. Those things are so inherently part of the music that I think a lot of music press tends to undermine that, like, or they just don't talk about it. It's all about like, is this cool? Is it not cool? I'm not going to use a pitchfork. Without saying, hey, you know what? There are human beings behind this, and the story of the human beings is just as compelling as the music can be itself, which is the other great thing about this book. So, I'm just looking at the time now. It's 7:22. I've been rambling for about 25 minutes now, and I don't think anybody's online. So that definitely cuts down the discussion element of this. So let me just wrap up with a couple of other things. If you are tuning into this late, again, it's 7:21, Tuesday, January 18th, 8 p.m. tonight on his Facebook page. Ron Hawkins of the Lowest of Low is resuming his Tommy Douglas Tuesdays, which is basically Ron sitting around talking about music and playing music, and they're an absolute delight. They're free. They're on Facebook. So definitely tune into that. Next week, I am going to be joined by Eastern Canada's rock and roll librarian himself, Mr. Darren Michael Boyd, who's got a new album out called Last Seen in Canada, which is available at darrenmichaelboyd.com. If you love guitar-driven rock, you are going to love this album. You're going to love all of Darren's music. He's an excellent performer. I'm not saying this because he's been a buddy since high school, but he is like one of the most talented, underrated guitarists this country ever has. And if you're looking for a really good guitarist, Darren has played with Famous Underground. He's played with, Slick Toxic. He's played with a whole bunch of different bands. His new album, and all of his albums are an absolute delight, but this one is an absolute treat. So Darren is going to join me next week, and we're going to talk about the 5 worst books ever written about rock and roll. If you've never seen Darren in full flight, you're in for a treat, because Darren is an absolute freaking hoot when he gets rolling. So come for the music, stay for the humor. Worst 5 books in rock and roll ever. Online stuff. Sloan is going to be doing an online playing party with like a viewing party, but with music, of It's Between the Bridges albums, Side Door on February 4th, I think at 8 p.m. The tickets are available on sidedoor.com. And so hopefully we'll get more people out. This might just end up being like a book talk, rock and roll book talk thing. I was hoping it was going to be a club where it's like we could get people in and people would, put like witty, observations in the chat and stuff like that. And it might still be like this, but if it's just me talking into a computer for a couple of minutes every 2 weeks, it's like I'm good with that too, because I like books and I like rock and roll, and I might ramble, but I like talking too. So let's go again for the Rock and Roll Book Club, the collaborative edition. Again, February 1st, major labels, Califasana. February 15th, Liz Phair, Horror Stories. And March 1st, Nobody Asked Me About the Girls, Lisa Robinson. Please support your local library, or just drop big hints at your local library that you'd like to have these books brought on. Support your local bookstores. Don't support, where possible, please don't support big, important, megalomaniac billionaires who jet themselves in his face, because inadvertently they always end up coming back. So anyway, this has been a pleasure. It's been a bit of an experiment, but what the hell, it's been fun. So thanks very much, and hope to see you on February 1st for Major Labels with Califasana. I'm Dawn Seb, and I hope you have a great day.